Centuries of Oppression, The Road to 1918. Chapter 25. Conclusion and Summary. Centuries of oppression there were, but it was oppression of the many by the few, not oppression of women by men. And the many were of both sexes, and the few were of both sexes. Prior to the 19th century, only around 2% of the adult male population could vote. The right to a parliamentary vote was dependent upon property. All but a few men were too poor to have the vote. Men had fought for the vote sporadically for centuries, but with no success until just before the Victorian era. On an historical time frame, men barely got the vote very much before women, as the graph shows clearly. Jeremy Bentham argued for women's suffrage as early as 1817, when only about 4% of adult men had the vote. And the campaigning for female suffrage intensified prior to 1867, thanks to John Stuart Mill, and at a time when still only about 12% of adult men had the vote. By 1884, when the proportion of adult men with the vote reached just 56%, there was already a majority of MPs supportive of female suffrage in some form. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst and their suffragettes did not bring about the enfranchisement of women. The non-militant women's suffragists were far more influential. The suffragettes' aim was gender-specific and class-specific, votes for women on the same terms as the existing franchise for men. They did not recognise the equal rights of working-class men, who were also largely disenfranchised. The larger Constitutionalist wing of the female suffragist movement finally achieved an alliance with the working men's claim via the Labour Party and the trade unions. Had the war not intervened, this alliance was, in fact, the only approach which could have succeeded. The perspective on universal suffrage that emphasises a male hegemony suppressing the rights of women is a serious distortion of historical reality. The truth is that the struggle for universal suffrage was the working class struggle, not primarily a gender issue. The historical big picture is that the enfranchisement of men and women was a single process. By far the most significant act in the history of extending the franchise was the 1918 Representation of the People Act. This brought 14 million people onto the electoral register, 5.5 million men and 8.5 million women. No previous act had enfranchised more than 2 million. Moreover, the 1918 Act was the first time that the principle of democracy had triumphed, the vote being recognised as a right rather than being tied to wealth or property. That no women were enfranchised before 1918, despite a majority of MPs having been in favour for over 30 years, was due to the big snag. Any attempt to give the vote only to upper crust women, as Mrs. Pankhurst wished, threatened the ruling Liberal Party's electoral chances, since it was assumed that such women would primarily increase the Conservative vote. This problem could, in principle, be avoided by simultaneously enfranchising the working class. But there was even greater parliamentary reluctance to give the vote to working men. This was the big snag, that votes for women, any women, required the vote to be given to working men first. This made the issue far more problematical because it required a change of mindset. It required a democratic mindset. It is hard for us now to understand that democracy had, until 1918, been regarded as a dangerously radical notion. I hope my history has made it clear that the 1918 Representation of the People Act was primarily about enfranchising working class men. The First World War was crucially instrumental in the change of heart which permitted the democratic principle to triumph. The old class-based sentiments, which had kept working class men disenfranchised, were ameliorated by the horrors of the World War I trenches and the recognition by the establishment of the country's indebtedness to working men. The 1918 Act was not primarily about the enfranchisement of women. Rather, women received the vote in the same Act simply because the barrier to their enfranchisement, that of working men, had been removed. Women got the vote as a collateral consequence of working men getting the vote. If you forget that the 1918 Act was really about giving working class men the vote, you will inevitably misunderstand the reason that women got the vote, and perhaps even commit the folly of thinking it was something to do with the Pankhursts. Since World War I played a crucial role in working men, and hence women, being enfranchised, one might say that the women's vote owes more to the Kaiser than to the Pankhursts. Any speculation as to what might have happened had the war not intervened is ultimately meaningless. The fact is that the slaughter in the trenches gave birth to a new mood of egalitarianism in Parliament, sweeping away the old class-based objections to enfranchising working class men. Consequently, one could say that the vote for working class men, and hence the vote for women, were bought with men's lives. It is understandable that the popular historical narrative has sought to draw a veil over this ugly truth. Indeed, it may be best to allow celebrations of the achievement of democracy to triumph over the manner of its attainment. But not entirely. The truth must not be buried. And this is the reason for my writing this history. My fear is that the celebrations which are due in February 2018 will bury the truth still further. And even if the fact that working men were enfranchised by the 1918 Act cannot be suppressed, the reason for it might well be subject to further false mythologizing. As an example, consider this preposterous remark made in Parliament on International Women's Day on the 8th of March 2016 by Madeleine Moon, MP for Bridgend. Everyone knows that women were given the vote at the end of the 1914-18 war, but that cloaked the fact that working class men were also given the vote. Does the honourable lady, like me, celebrate the fact that women, through their campaigning, also led to those men accessing the vote? That should never be forgotten. Are we to have Mrs. Pankhurst lauded as winning the vote for men now? Is this ignorance? Or is it a deliberate rewriting of the history that has already been so traduced in the public mind? The prevailing myth that the vote for women resulted from triumphing over male hegemony has been exposed as a monstrous perversion of reality, an untruth which has persisted for a century and must now be discarded. The truth is that universal suffrage for both sexes was pioneered by men and paid for over many centuries by vast numbers of men's deaths.